3. The Cathedral. The deep state has far more effect on your children and grandchildren's future than your elected officials do, but it doesn't act alone. As our Wikipedia example in the last chapter shows, the deep state works hand in hand with so-called private organizations to accomplish its goals. This gray area between public and private governance has a name: the Cathedral. There have been men in power who have challenged the Cathedral: Joseph McCarthy, Enoch Powell, George Wallace, Huey Long, Richard Nixon, and many others. These men share many things in common, but the main thing they share is that polite society tells you to hate them. Maybe you have reason to hate them. That isn't the point. The point is that these men and what they stood for had deep and overwhelming popular support in their day, and this popular support made not a bit of difference. What made the difference? The support of the Cathedral. Let's spell out the Cathedral a little more precisely. The Cathedral is what you get when you think of universities, the mainstream media, NGOs, and big business as informal branches of government. What the Cathedral is not is the Illuminati. It's not a cabal of people who meet in smoke-filled rooms and hatch nefarious schemes. The Cathedral is simply the consensus-building mechanism of modern society. But every society in history has had consensus-building mechanisms. What makes the Cathedral a useful concept is the recognition that our own mechanism is the same as it was for the 15th century Catholic or the ancient Egyptian. It just wears a mask now that makes it look like a set of private institutions and not an extension of government. It's the modern church to the modern state, hence the Cathedral. This consensus-building mechanism works in two ways, a fast and a slow way. The fast way is by the art of persuasion. This is when the Cathedral paints the Nixons and McCarthys of the world as sick, twisted, and corrupt, whether they are or not. The slow way is by top-down social engineering. Opposition to these Nixons and McCarthys is made an explicit tenet of the faith in elite training institutions. Universities indoctrinate bright but impressionable young people into hating all that these men stood for. These young people become future elites. Elites repeat these points of doctrine as articles of faith. Elites dictate popular tastes. These men, who have challenged the Cathedral, have all failed spectacularly, but there is one who has done its serious damage, and who is hated more than any of them: Donald Trump. Trump failed to enact every point of his campaign: immigration reform, America First trade policy, and ending war in the Middle East, but he bypassed the normal channels controlled by the Cathedral and spoke directly to his Democratic base. This may not seem like much, but it has broken the hegemony of one part of the Cathedral, the mainstream media. The whole apparatus reacted allergically to this, spasming uncontrollably to expel what it deems a foreign and dangerous virus. The mask has now slipped. These fits have shown normal people that the Cathedral is very real, is connected to the deep state, and very much hates them. Normal people have seen the Cathedral. This is unforgivable, and Trump will never be forgiven for forcing its hand. The blur between public and private is not limited to the press, to universities, nor to private companies like Wikipedia. You'll find it perhaps most glaringly in non-governmental organizations or NGOs. A good example of how the Cathedral works can be found in the Black Lives Matter movement. Popular opinion takes BLM to be grassroots activism by private citizens. In reality, BLM is a top-down movement funded by NGOs to carry out government initiatives as though they were grassroots activism by private citizens. In an Open Society Foundation's board meeting soon after the death of Freddie Gray, the government is cited as seeking philanthropic support for its initiatives around the supposedly unjust treatment of the black population by police. The Open Society Foundations discuss how best to ensure effective implementation of these initiatives given the federal government's limited authority to dictate reform at the local level. This is a private organization bypassing safeguards against government overreach, attempting to enact police reforms that are democratically unpopular. In a later meeting, these same people agonize over how to square BLM's total dependence on NGO and government funding with their mythology of grassroots activism. Does philanthropy undermine the field when it advocates directly in spheres of political influence instead of empowering guarantees to do the same? Are there times when philanthropy can use its levers of influence to expedite change as institutional actors mature? During World War I and World War II, the U.S. government effectively deputized journalists, making them civil servants. There is no reason to think the situation has changed, except the formality. Mainstream media outlets behave as though they have access to classified information because they do. Nothing is different today than in World War II, nor is it different than in the ancient world. Oswald Spengler said in 1928, "The classical forum, the Western press are, essentially, intellectual engines of the ruling city." And this is now as true as it was then. The cathedral is not something new, because societies have always been totalizing, meaning that all aspects of life are an organic whole, with no distinction between sacred and secular, church and state, public and private. Far from a conspiracy, the cathedral is just us noticing what everyone else has always known, that the distinction between public and private is not real. Hostile elements in the public and private spheres work together to disenfranchise normal people until they can elect a new and less problematic people. But how do they do it? After all, Harvard, CNN, the SPLC, and Twitter aren't a military. They wield only soft power. How do they turn it into hard power? We'll take this up in the next chapter. Summary. There is no public-private distinction. Every state has its church, and the cathedral are the informal branches of the government. 4. High-low versus middle. The thread common to the past 3 chapters is that modern liberal societies hold their unstable elements together by obscuring who is in charge. They obscure the continuity between public and private. They obscure who makes decisions in government. They obscure the sovereign, but above all, they obscure how power dynamics work. Liberalism is built on this. A society that's honest with itself about how power works ceases to be liberal. Most views on power dynamics break society into 3 categories. High, official power, usually government, or a part of it. Middle, unofficial power, such as industry, prominent families, clans, unions, the church, cultural heroes, etc. Low, everyone else. This is not a class theory like Marxism. These are not quite classes, more like functions in the society. There's a lot more to say about it, but this gives us a clear enough picture. The basic bitch view of power since the Enlightenment is that the high and the middle team up to stomp on the low. Liberalism says the king and the church team up to fuck over the peasant. Communism says the capitalist and bourgeois team up to fuck the worker. High middle versus low. This all sounds really red-pilled to your average Chomsky reader and will get you a tenure-track position at Princeton, but unfortunately reality doesn't care about tenure. A deeper reading of history paints a different picture. High-low versus middle. The king isn't afraid of a peasant revolt. He's afraid of his nobles organizing a peasant revolt. He's afraid of the church trying to turn his neat and tidy monarchy into a theocracy. But the high has a problem. It needs the middle because the middle is all the unofficial powers in society. Think of these as moral authorities. The high is always insecure about the middle because the middle is the only game in town that can challenge it. But the middle is always challenging the high because it wants to get free of the king's power. So the king and his nobles have an uneasy relationship. The king is fine with them as long as they don't get too powerful, but of course the nobles always want to increase their power. So when one of them gets too powerful, what does the king do? He says to the man in the street, "Fuck this baron, what has he ever done for you? All he ever does is put his boot on your neck. You need me, the king, to put down this petty tyrant." So the high allies with the low to beat on the middle. This is, of course, exactly what's happening today, and we all know it in our gut. Official power is allying with the underclass to displace old stock American institutions and elect a new people that can be more easily ruled. In normal times, the high wields the low like a club to beat the middle. This is when official power is consolidating itself. Eventually, the middle fights back, takes hold of normal people, and overturns official power. We call these overturnings revolutions. Forget kings and peasants, let's bring it back to the present. The deep state, the unaccountable power brokers in government, don't want to be hindered by unions or the church or by anyone else, so they wield the lowest of the low, the people who will always be at the bottom of the status hierarchy in a healthy society, as a club against those unofficial powers that make up the middle, and you get bake the cake, bigot, take a knee, #MeToo, and stay woke. 2020 and on has made this all painfully clear. The fiery but mostly peaceful riots after the death of George Floyd saw AstroTurf as far as the eye can see, with FBI reports themselves detailing paid activism. As of June 2, 2020, unidentified individuals discussed various websites for payment to agitate and commit violent acts. Money was transferred to the individuals anonymously via Bitcoin. The payments were rumored to be managed by members of Antifa. The targets and locations were also discussed on the websites, NFI. One of these websites was Crowds on Demand, a firm that brazenly rents AstroTurf protesters to anyone. They're not alone. Crowds on Demand isn't the only outfit that hires paid protesters, though it is perhaps the most open about what it does, said Edward Walker, a UCLA sociology professor who wrote a book on astroturfing, Grassroots for Hire, Public Affairs Consultants in American Democracy. There are hundreds of lobbying firms and public affair firms that do this work, though not all in the same way, he said. Some only do a little bit of this grassroots for hire, but things adjacent to this are not uncommon today. Bitcoin is not anonymous, and these payments to Crowds on Demand were, unsurprisingly, never followed up on. This turning a blind eye is just one way that the deep state puts its finger on the scale to disempower its critics. The cottage industry of fake protesters, Antifa being the biggest, is another. Both were part of a strategy to turn soft power into hard power. With a sober view of power dynamics, it's clear that social change is not bottom-up. If normal people are to get what they want, they'll need to attach themselves to a particular man, probably a disaffected elite, with perfect loyalty on both sides of the relationship. There are highly vilified cases of this throughout the 20th century, and these are the best examples of success so far. Trump was a very imperfect example, and his failed revolution was an attempt at middle-low versus high. It's not just that he damaged the cathedral, as we pointed out. What he represented was the complete overthrow of the present order. We can see why the allergic reaction. These revolutions have happened all throughout history, and there is no reason why it can't again. High-low versus middle thrives on concealment. Again, this is not new. Indo-European peoples held it at bay by the formal relationship of clientship, and something like this may be required. For any major social change in modern times, you can trace it back to a patron that cleared the way for it long before people ever took to the streets. We are reminded of the old Sun Tzu maxim, every battle is won or lost before it is ever fought. High-low versus middle forecloses on any hope of grassroots change, but knowledge of this is power, because to abandon grassroots change is to abandon liberalism, and liberalism is the problem. Everything is either dictated by a center, or is authorized by a center, or is dictated or authorized by a power in a position to challenge the center. But does it have to be destructive? Does the center, the high, have to be so hostile to normal people as to run society into the ground? No. There is hope, friends. Summary. The king allies with the peasant, not the baron. Official power must either capture unofficial powers or destroy them. There is no grassroots social change.